Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's well, it's really close to my heart, honestly, and that's how people on the autism spectrum experience grief and loss.
It's definitely something we need to talk about more. Grief is universal, but the way it's felt and expressed, well, can be very different for autistic individuals.
Right, and we've got this article from Cheap ABA. They're a fantastic resource for autism info. And this piece, Autism and Bereavement, well, let's just say it's got some seriously insightful stuff. So we're going to unpack it all today and hopefully gain a better understanding of how to support people who are grieving.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the article really emphasizes how profound grief can be for autistic individuals.
Yeah.
One of the reasons for that is this idea of intensified emotions. Can you break that down for us a little? What does that actually mean, like in the context of grief?
Well, think about it this way. You know how you might feel a wave of sadness when you experience loss? Imagine that wave hitting you with like the force of a tsunami. That's kind of what it can feel like for someone on the spectrum. Their
Mm.
neurology is just wired for more intense emotions.
No, that's a really powerful image. And I imagine that can lead to all sorts of challenges, right? It's not just feeling sadder, it's that the intensity of those feelings can make it
Mhm.
harder to cope, to even think straight or just function in daily life.
Exactly. It's super overwhelming. And we're not just talking about sadness here. It's confusion, anger, fear, all those emotions that come with grief just amplified. It's like trying to navigate a maze, but during an earthquake. The ground is constantly shifting and it's hard to find your footing.
Okay, so now imagine you're trying to support a child who's going through all that.
Mhm.
How do you even begin to help them understand what they're feeling when it's so intense?
That's where understanding the unique challenges of autistic grief is so important. And speaking of feeling overwhelmed, the sensory environment can play a huge role in how an autistic person experiences grief. Imagine you're already feeling all these emotions so intensely, and then on top of that, you're bombarded with sensory input that's magnified for you.
Like at a funeral, for example.
Hmm.
All the sights and sounds, people crying, somber music, maybe even strong smells. I can see how that could be really difficult to handle. And then you've got all the social expectations of a funeral on top of that.
Exactly. People might expect hugs or condolences, which can be really challenging for someone who struggles with social interaction or touch. And all of this, while they're trying to process the loss itself, it's just layer upon layer of difficulty.
So someone might see an autistic person and think, oh, they're being cold or uncaring
Hmm.
because they're not expressing their grief in a way that we think of as typical.
Yeah.
But in reality, they're just completely overwhelmed.
Exactly. And that's why awareness is crucial. Grief might manifest differently for someone on the spectrum, but their internal experience might be just as intense, if not more so, even if they're not showing it the same way.
This reminds me of something I read about the challenges.
Yeah.
The challenges autistic individuals face with executive function. That's the part of our brain that helps us plan or organize, make decisions, things that already get harder when we're grieving. How does this play out for someone on the spectrum who's experiencing a loss?
Well, picture this. You're trying to plan a memorial service, sort through your loved one's belongings, or even just figure out what to eat for dinner, and your brain feels like it's stuck in quicksand. That's executive dysfunction for anyone. But
Yeah.
for someone on the spectrum, those challenges are amplified even further.
So you're dealing with this profound grief, this sensory overload.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, even simple tasks feel impossible. It's like every aspect of life just became 10 times harder.
Yeah, it really is a perfect storm of challenges, and it can actually lead to something called delayed grief.
Delayed grief, what's that?
So it's basically when those typical grief reactions, the sadness, the crying, the anger, they don't show up right away. They might be bottled up inside for weeks, months, even years sometimes.
So the person is grieving. It's just that they're processing it differently in a
Yeah,
different timeline.
exactly. And think about what we were just talking about, the intense emotions, the sensory overload, the executive function struggles. Their system is overloaded, and it takes time to process everything.
That makes a lot of sense. It also highlights how important it is to be patient and understanding. Just because someone isn't showing their grief in a way that we expect doesn't mean they're not hurting.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder to check in with them regularly, even if it's weeks or months after the loss. Let them know you're there for them without judgment or expectations.
The article also mentions the importance of routines. We touched on that a bit earlier. But I'm curious, how does the disruption of routine specifically impact an autistic person who's grieving?
Well, for many people on the spectrum, routines provide a sense of predictability and control, which can be incredibly comforting, especially when everything else feels chaotic. When a loved one dies, those routines are often disrupted. Meals might be at different times, familiar activities might be canceled, their whole day might be thrown off.
They're dealing with the emotional fallout of the loss,
Yeah,
but then also their sense of stability and security is shaken up.
exactly. It's like losing your anchor in the middle of a storm. And that can lead to increased anxiety meltdowns, even withdrawal.
So what can we do to help? How can we create an environment that feels supportive and safe for someone who's autistic and grieving?
The article highlights 3 key strategies: validating emotions, creating sensory-friendly environments, and maintaining routines as much as possible.
Okay, let's break those down. Starting with validating emotions. What does that actually look like in practice?
It means acknowledging their feelings, even if they're not expressing them in those typical ways. Saying things like, I can see you're hurting, or it's okay to feel sad, or even just offering a hug if they're comfortable with that.
So even if they're not crying or talking about their feelings, we can still validate their experience by just recognizing that they're going through something difficult.
Exactly. It's about showing them that their feelings are valid, no matter how they're expressed.
What about sensory-friendly environments? How can we make those spaces around them more manageable?
Well, this is where thinking about all the senses comes in. Imagine you're at a funeral, the lights are bright, the music's loud, people are talking and crying, there are strong smells of flowers and perfume. For someone with sensory sensitivities, that can be totally overwhelming.
So it's not just about finding a quiet space. It's about minimizing sensory input across the board.
Exactly. You can try dimming the lights, turning down the music, offering noise-canceling headphones, providing a quiet space where they can retreat if needed. It's all about creating an environment that feels safe and calming, rather than overstimulating.
And finally, maintaining routines. How can we help with that? Especially when so much is changing around them.
This is where consistency is key. Try to maintain their usual meal times, their bedtime routines, any other activities that give them structure and comfort. Even if you can't stick to the exact schedule, try to keep things as predictable as possible.
It's like creating a little island of normalcy in the middle of all the chaos.
Exactly. And honestly, it can make a world of difference. The article mentions that the sense of predictability can help reduce anxiety and just make the whole grieving process feel a little less overwhelming.
It's amazing how something as simple as a bedtime routine can be such a powerful source of comfort during a hard time. I'm starting to see how all of these strategies, validating emotions, creating those sensory-friendly spaces, and sticking to routines, they all work together to create a more supportive environment for someone who's autistic and grieving. It's a really holistic approach that takes their unique needs into account.
And remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about making an effort to understand their experience and offering support in ways that are meaningful to them.
The article also touches on the role of rituals in bereavement, which I think can be a tricky area for autistic individuals. They might crave the predictability of a ritual, but then find the sensory and social aspects overwhelming. How do we navigate that?
That's a great point. And it brings us back to that idea of flexibility and individualization. Maybe instead of attending a large funeral service, they would feel more comfortable visiting the gravesite quietly or having a smaller gathering with just close family. It's about honoring their needs and finding what feels right for them, even if it goes against tradition.
Yeah, sounds like. The key is to be mindful and adaptable, just like with everything else when it comes to supporting autistic individuals.
Exactly. And you can always ask, what would make you feel most comfortable? Is there anything I can do to make this easier for you? Just those simple questions can go a long way in showing that you care and that you're willing to meet their needs.
It's about collaborating,
Yeah.
not imposing. We're not trying to force them into some box of what we think grief should look like, but create a space for them to express their grief authentically.
Right. And that's a powerful message for all of us, I think. Whether we're supporting someone who's grieving or just interacting with people who are different from us, it's about recognizing that. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to the human experience.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation, honestly. I feel like I've learned so much about how to be more sensitive and supportive, not just in the context of grief, but in all my interactions with people on the spectrum.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, learning is a lifelong journey. The more we understand about neurodiversity, the better equipped we are to create a world that's truly inclusive and compassionate.
Speaking of learning, what are some key takeaways that you'd want our listeners to walk away with today?
Well, first and foremost, I hope they have a deeper understanding now of how autism can shape the experience of grief and loss. It's not about labeling or pathologizing, but about recognizing those neurological underpinnings
Mhm.
that contribute to their unique emotional and sensory landscape.
And how can our listeners use this new understanding to provide better support?
Well, that's where those strategies we talked about come in. Validating emotions, creating those sensory-friendly spaces, maintaining routines, and just simply asking, what can I do to help?
Hmm.
Every small act of understanding can make a real difference.
It's about meeting people where they are, both literally and figuratively. What a great way to sum up this deep dive.
I think so too. And remember, grief is complex. It's multifaceted. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. Everyone's journey is unique.
So true. And as we wrap up today, I want to leave you with a final thought.
Mm.
As you move forward, consider how the unique strengths of artistic individuals,
Mm.
like their deep empathy and their attention to detail, can actually be assets in the grieving process. How might these strengths show up in ways we might not typically expect?
That's a wonderful question to think about. And it speaks to the power of neurodiversity. When we embrace those differences, we open ourselves up to new perspectives and new possibilities.
This has been a truly enriching conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into autism and bereavement. We hope you found it insightful and helpful.
Remember, the journey of understanding and compassion continues long after this deep dive ends.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.